If you would, open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. Proverbs 29:18 says this, where there is no vision, the people will perish. C.S. Lewis said this, you're never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream. Let me ask us this, what in our mind, what is our picture of Moses? You know, maybe we see him in Pharaoh's court saying, let my people go. Or maybe we think of him in front of the Red Sea with his staff causing the waters to part. Maybe we think of him walking up the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments. Those typically are the things that come to my mind when I think of Moses. But here's the thing. Moses wasn't always challenging pharaohs and parting seas. In Exodus 3, he's just a shepherd. And he's not a young shepherd boy at that. Do you know how old he is at this point? Yes, 80. How would you like that? 80 years old and watching sheep. And actually it's for your father-in-law at that, to make matters worse. You know, Jethro. I mean, hardly the image, right, of this successful leader. And this point in life, though, Moses, he is an experienced shepherd. I mean, he's tended sheep on the backside of the Midian wilderness now for 40 long years. Let's not rush past that point for just a minute. Think about that. 4 decades of long, lonely days with nothing to do except look at sheep. Can you imagine? And 4 decades of probably thinking or wondering, if I would have only. 4 decades of watching his dreams slip away. Now, earlier in Exodus 2, we read that Moses, remember, he's raised, we know this, in the house of Pharaoh. Though he was a Hebrew baby, he was raised as a prince. So, for 40 years of his life, he's in Pharaoh's palace. He has it all. And we wonder how many times he dreamed of, delivering his people from the Egyptian bondage, because Acts 7:23 says that it was in his heart to help and care for his people. In fact, we know he's so anxious maybe to be the deliverer and try to prove himself by his own strength, he kills an Egyptian, right, who is beating a Hebrew slave. And Moses' his failure really devastated him. And that's why God took him to the desert, to the wilderness, and made him that shepherd for 40 years. He had to learn that deliverance came from God, not from his own hands. I mean, that murder was really his undoing. I mean, he's forced to flee Egypt, we know, as a fugitive. And that's where we find him as we start here in Exodus 3. Think about this. He spent 40 years waiting to be a deliverer, and now 40 years waiting to be delivered, right, from the mess that he'd gotten himself into. One of the greatest things I think about the Bible is we see God using over and over again normal, flawed people. I mean, Moses is more than, that flannel board figure that most of us grew up playing. I don't know if we played with it. Teachers probably didn't let us play with those back then, did they? I don't know. But anyway, he's just a regular person, who probably thought, I have blown my last chance. And I can't help but think in the years he spent leading those sheep instead of leading people, do you wonder how many times Moses probably assumed, my dream is dead. I'm too old to do anything important. And how many times he probably regretted his past and maybe even dreaded the future. I mean, we don't know what went through his mind during those 40 years in the wilderness, but we do know this, that he is shocked and surprised when God speaks to him in this burning bush. Let's look a little closer here for just a second here at Exodus 3 and what Moses saw. You remember, he's just going about, verse 1, his daily business of watching sheep. And the angel of the Lord, verse 2, appears to him in a blazing fire from the midst of this bush. And here's several things here. Number one, what Moses saw. That God can take an insignificant, just a bush, and turn it into a miracle. I mean, out here, maybe we'd say a tumbleweed. I don't know. And the thing is, that's what God wanted to do with Moses. It was a picture of what God had planned for him. Moses was that weak bush, that tumbleweed, but God was the fire. He was the one that could help. And Moses could accomplish anything if he realized where his power came from. And here's what Moses heard. Look in verse 10. Therefore come now, and I'll send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. Here's what he heard, God's statement, I'll send you. And what do you think Moses thought? I mean, he's smelling like sheep. And he thinks that's his life. And he's probably thinking, why would God want to use a failure like me? And yet God says, I'll send you. But what did Moses do? We know this story. He should have rejoiced because God was finally answering his prayer, right? That you can be a deliverer. But instead, what's he do? He argues with God and tries to escape what he's been wanting to do all these years. And Moses gave at least 4 reasons here why he couldn't accept God's call. And I tell you what, these excuses sound so much like our excuses that we have. Chapter 3, 11 and 12, Moses said, who am I? Who am I? Moses is saying, I'm a nobody. But here's the thing, what Moses thought of himself or what even others thought of Moses really wasn't important. God had spoken, and that's all that Moses needed for assurance. Number 2, he says over in chapter 4, I think it's about verse 1, what if? What if? The what if syndrome. Do you ever find yourself like Moses, asking what if? I mean, think of how many goals and dreams, not only for our lives, but for even the life of this church, has literally been what if to death. And Satan thrives on what ifs. In chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, then he tells God, he says, verse 10 says, I've never been eloquent speaker. I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. And then what's God's reply? Who made your mouth? And the lesson is obvious. The God who created us is powerful enough to use us. And so he tries one more thing here in chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. He says, you know what? Someone else can do it better. That's kind of like passing the buck, isn't it? So we don't have to do it. Brad can do it better. Brad, you come up here and preach, and I'll sit. And Sam, we know he can preach better than I can because he's preached forever. Moses is still doubting that he can make a difference. But God is saying, yes, you can. Here's the thing. With God, it is not what if, but why not? Why not? God says we can make a difference. God knows us better than we know ourselves. We must trust Him. When we, and kind of like Moses here, when we go through all this and we tell God all of our weaknesses, we aren't telling Him anything He doesn't already know. I want us to remember this, that the will of God will never lead us where the power of God can't enable us. And we know the rest of this story. God wouldn't take no for an answer. He answers Moses' question with, who am I? With his promise in chapter 3, verse 14. And God says, I am who I am. And he sent Moses, we know, back to Egypt to deliver his people. And Moses became the biblical hero that we know him because God showed up in a bush in the wilderness and gave him a new beginning at age 80. It's never too late to dream again. Larry read Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. When we dream a big dream for God, we become totally dependent on it. We seek Him more. We trust Him more. And we recognize our need for Him. And in that story of Moses, God reminds us it's never too late to dream again. At one point in his life, Moses may have looked like the person to do great things for God, but when we see him here in chapter 3, verse 1, not now. It looked like he was really finished. He's messed up. He's too old. From the human viewpoint, Moses looked, to us, the thing about this, you're trying to hire a new preacher. You want someone who's 40 or 80? Huh? Yeah, you know the answer. From God's viewpoint, He knew Moses needed 40 more years of wilderness training. And then God showed up one day and He says, you know what? Now you're ready. And maybe we can relate to that. Maybe we can understand Moses' situation better than most. If we've gone through a personal failure, found ourselves living below our potential, or feel like we're still hidden in the wilderness, be encouraged. God may show up in a burning bush for us. Moses made his faith active. He took the steps to fulfill the plan of God, and we know that story. God was faithful to show up, to show him what to do, and He gave him the strength to do it. But Moses still had to step out in faith, right? And the same thing with us. Turn for just a second, Ephesians 3, verse 20. Ephesians 3:20 says, "Now to him who's able to do far more," some versions say exceedingly, "abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us." You know what? That passage is full of so many great words. Exceedingly abundantly. Some versions say infinitely beyond. Far more. The point is, God wants to do something great in our lives. This verse simply says, God is able. God's able. So let me ask us this two questions. What's the wildest dream that we have about our spiritual life? And number two, what's our wildest dream for this church? And here's the thing. We can never exceed God's ability to answer. As one last thought here, and we'll close. As we read the Bible, we see time and time again God calling improbable people to do impossible things. Time and time again, we read about people who thought they'd, missed their chance in life. But God did something great in them. He gave them another opportunity. Let me give you a few examples. Think of Esther. She was taken as a concubine for King Xerxes, and she would eventually become the queen. Who in the world would have thought that? God uses her to save a nation. Abraham and Sarah, they couldn't have children. And God spoke to them, told them they're going to have a son. And you remember what they did? They laughed. They laughed. You see, God was doing more than what they thought could be possible. Peter denies the Lord. He preaches the first gospel sermon. Saul was a Pharisee and a persecutor of the church. The last person in the world. If you'd have asked people in that day, he would have been the last person in the world that they would say, oh yeah, God's going to use this guy someday. It's on our, let's see, when we're coming in, right back here, Matthew 19:16, with God, what's possible? All things. Wherever, let me just conclude with this, wherever we are in life, if we're hurting, if we're healed, if we're in the palace, or if we find ourselves in the wilderness, here's the thing. Keep dreaming. Keep dreaming for God. Keep believing that God can use us. It's a lot of times we have dreams and we have goals, but what happens to them? Yeah. So it takes work on our part to carry through with those dreams and those goals. Hebrews 11:6, the last phrase, says this: God's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. A rewarder. He wants to reward us. He wants to help us. So be constant in our commitment. Three little 3 two-word statements. Dream big, pray big, and believe big. And ask God this, to put something in our heart so big, that it can only happen by His power. There's no doubt in our mind, how many times have we made a comment, that was a God thing? Ask God to do a God thing in our lives and in the life of this church. Then take the steps, refuse to give up, and keep dreaming. Drew's going to come lead us in a